Hello again. Of course, there's no such thing as a lovely war, but I think I was correct in my assessment of the situation Belgium was forced into, the bullying that they faced in trying to release frozen Russian assets, which would have been illegal. So the Belgians showed courage and they were correct in resisting this. And what you've seen is Europeans have had to backpedal and try and present what is a catastrophic failure as a victory via a 90, I think it's a 90 billion euro loan to keep Ukraine functioning as a country, and arguably, no doubt, to try to keep them in this war in the hope that they can escalate it and bring in the United States to try to um, thwart any sort of peace efforts, which would lay bare the catastrophic failure of the proxy war the UK and Europe have been trying to fight against Russia in Ukraine. As I've always said, they would have been far, far better putting their weight behind the peace talks brokered by the Turks early into the war, and a huge amount of money and lives could have been saved. The problem is what the UK and Europe have done in even contemplating seizing frozen assets is they've sent a clear message to the rest of the world that your assets aren't safe in the financial system, the Western financial system, and they have, So when you see these sort of brick type meetings, and Trump gets angry because people start looking at dollar alternatives and so on and so forth, it's moves like that that encourage it. Because if you were outside of the what we call the West and you had assets you wanted to find custody for somewhere, you have to look for alternatives if you think they can be arbitrarily seized. Now, you can make a very viable argument that the Russians should make a substantial contribution to the reconstruction of Ukraine when we eventually have peace, hopefully sooner rather than later. But that has to be done bilaterally or via a legal process of arbitration. And you can't take it an arbitrary decision and just effectively steal assets. And that is your problem. And I think what why this situation in Ukraine is so important, in my opinion, is I think it's going to show or bring about the downfall of what I would call the vacuous politician. Your Starmers, your Macrons, your Merz, your von der Leyens, your Callises, and so on and so forth. People who generally are idiotic enough to believe that if you keep repeating narratives, they will come true. And Rachel Reeves has done it a lot in the UK as well. Um, that you would have heard from the start of this very tragic war: victory for Ukraine, victory for Ukraine, victory for Ukraine, victory for Ukraine. But they had no plan to do it other than a vain hope that they could use American money, top it up by a bit of European money, and largely with Ukrainian lives, that they could achieve an embarrassing defeat of Putin in Ukraine, and that would lead to regime change in Russia. But it spectacularly failed. And you see now that they've had to backpedal a bit and say a just peace for Ukraine, a just peace for Ukraine, a just peace for Ukraine. But they're doing everything they can to stop it. And I'd like to put one other thing into context: is this push from the UK via Starmer, um, that putting peacekeepers in Ukraine, UK peacekeepers. There's a few reasons why they want to do that. Is one, they know that Putin can't accept it, because if you've gone to war on the premise of um, pushing back against NATO expansion, um, then there's no way he could accept that in terms of his objectives of this war, because effectively the peacekeepers would be NATO expansion by a different means, and they kind of hope that either it will embarrass him or it will provoke him. If they can actually get them in there, provoke them, use them as effectively bait to provoke the Russians into an action where they can then try to say, look, to the United States, come in and this is Russian aggression. You need to come in and help us defend against that. So they want to use them as bait almost to escalate the war, which is an obscenely bad thing to do. To put it into context, as I've always said, I don't personally condone the invasion of Ukraine. I'd always like to see war avoided at all costs. But to say it's not provoked is a lie. That's a real uh, cynical lie, because in essence, if you look at the Minsk Accords, if you look at the promises around the Western sponsored coup in Ukraine in 2014, the Maidan, um, the Russians have got rights to believe that they've been deceived. They've got the rights to believe that they've been deceived on NATO expansion. And they have, in my opinion, and many others as well. Um, so it's a lie to say that it was unprovoked. They also had legitimate concerns about the treatment of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, the use of Russian as a language, and so on and so forth. These were not idle complaints. Um, so there was significant provocation. And the issue you face is if you've got a counterpart in negotiations and you keep telling them that their concerns are not legitimate, you keep overriding them, you keep besmirching them, then eventually they'll come away and they'll think, we've got to do something, because they won't listen. They just will not listen. And then you get this escalation because you almost leave them with no alternative, which is exactly the story of this war. And let me attend to this. I mean, the other thing as well, if you look at history, and there's this silly nonsense that they keep pushing that Russia wants to attack Europe and sort of march through continental Europe and hop, skip, and a jump over to the Channel. If you look at history, it's been Europe that's attacked Russia, not the other way around. And this is not propaganda. Read yourselves. And when those attacks have come, they've usually come via Ukraine. So it's always going to be a sensitive issue for them. And their concerns can't be just discarded. There have to be a situation where both sides talk and they understand each other's concerns. And that comes with responsibility on both sides. And it's far better to understand those concerns, try to address them, and live in peace rather than try to provoke war. Because the provocation of war is actually coming from Europe, not the other way around. As I say, I don't condone the invasion of Ukraine, but they were almost left in a situation where they felt there was nothing else they could do because all their concerns were dismissed. And here's another one for you. Um, and I covered this in the book Lost the Races. That when you get this notion that the West is always right and everybody else is always wrong, and the West has to civilize everybody else, and so on and so forth, it, it just will lead to more wars. And as you look at your um, news feeds today, your newspapers, and also in the coming days, how many condemnations do you see from Starmer and the Europeans over what the Americans are doing in Venezuela, blockading it, seizing oil, and demanding regime change? How would they react if Putin did that? But it's silent because it's America. Now, I'm not going to make a view on Nicolas Maduro. He's not my concern. He's the president of Venezuela, but the Venezuelans will ultimately decide what to do. But here we have America trying to dictate who runs that country and who benefits from its oil. But there's silence. Nobody says anything in the Western world about it. Perhaps this is where the problems arise from, this hypocrisy, this double dealing, and so on and so forth. And as I said in the book Lost the Races, look at the world, look at an atlas of the world. The center of the world should be Eurasia. Imagine if you had a situation, and I'll include the UK in this, the UK, Europe, let's move into the Russian Federation, then China, India, and all the other great nations in that landmass, and say, if they got together and said, we're not going to interfere in each other's concerns, we're not going to undermine each other, we're not going to tell each other how to govern each other. What we can do is we can cooperate, we can trade, we can work and enjoy mutual prosperity of the Eurasian landmass and work together on respectful, equal terms. And if ever that were to happen, and unfortunately there are vested interests to stop that happening, I would conclude that prosperity would take a turn for the better very quickly. There's a concluding thought for you. Take care. Bye.